Ladies and gents, hello and welcome to ROG Pulse, the weekly show where we dive into all things tech and gaming. But today, we are focusing specifically on how to optimize your games for the Ally, your laptop, or your PC, but also the fact that the Z1 model of the Ally is now officially available.
Yeah, there are a lot of Ally updates this week, so I felt like this would be a good week to just cram it all in. So first of all, yes, the Z1 model of the ROG Ally is here. I'm popping a link in chat for y'all to go check out our article that we wrote on the topic. We've got like some benchmarks in there so you can kind of look and see which model is right for you. You know, if you want to save $100 and you're mostly playing indie and retro games, maybe a little bit of AAA, but you don't mind turning down the resolution or the frame rates that are what you're happy with, then the Z1 is a good option there. You save a little bit of money. The Z1 Extreme, obviously, the best option available if you want maximum performance. But what is cool about the Z1 is that if you've been waiting to buy the Ally, can't decide which model you get, both models benefit from all of the features that we have added to the Ally since launch. And that was the next thing I wanted to talk about. We released another software update this week that addressed a lot of things that people were asking for. And actually want to show a couple of them off here before we get into today's main topic. So two of the big things in the software update this week. One is the ability to calibrate your joysticks and triggers. So if you go into the Ally settings, you'll see this little option here that says calibrate. And this ensures that you're getting like the max range out of your joysticks and triggers, because sometimes it can vary a little bit from device to device. So, but when I went in and did it, I, like a dingus, didn't actually like read the instructions. I just started like mashing buttons, and hey, I wasn't doing it right. So I thought I would like show everyone how to do it. If you want to calibrate the stick, you go into this menu, you press A to start the calibration, and then you can push the joystick over to the circle and you hold it until it says you're good. You see a little timer there. So you can do that for the sticks. The triggers are also important, and I know a lot of people have been wanting this feature for the triggers so they can calibrate and get the max range from their triggers. I've seen a few people have issues with it. This was the same issue that I have. When you press A to start calibration, you have to wait for a second until you get that check mark, because it needs to calibrate that first position before you can calibrate the second position. Does that make sense?
I mean, the best advice we can give you is follow the on-screen prompts. It specifically says wait 1 second, so wait that 1 second, then go.
I was not waiting the second. I was like, let's go, and just pushing the thing down, and it wasn't letting me go. So I wanted to just throw that out there so people were like, okay, this is how you calibrate everything. And once you do that, it should feel better than ever. Another thing that we added here in the joystick customization settings down here is an anti-dead zone slider. And I want to talk about this in a little bit of detail for a minute, because this has been a topic of discussion since the Ally came out. There are a number of users, not everyone, but a small number of users that felt like the sticks weren't as responsive as they wanted them to be. And there was kind of a hard time like nailing down what it was when it first came out. Some people were like, "Oh, it feels like there's like input lag." It wasn't that. Some people said that it felt like they had strong dead zones. It turns out it actually wasn't dead zones. Our sticks have at the firmware level a very similar dead zone to what you would find on any other controller. But as we dug into it, and that's why it took us a little bit of time to address this in releases, because we were trying to be very meticulous in finding the actual source of this feedback, and so it took us some time, but we got there, and we wanted to do it right. It turns out that what is more likely is that some people are experiencing a difference in what they expect from the sensitivity curve of the joystick. So in that early range of the joystick, it is accepting the input. It's not a dead zone, but the input might just not be as strong as what you're expecting. And so instead of your character or camera moving really, a certain speed in that range, it's moving a little bit slower than you expect, which can feel kind of like a dead zone or latency, but it's not. So these should feel better when you calibrate them, and then and certain games also can have their own software dead zones that then compound on that. So what we did is we added this anti-dead zone slider. Now this is a little bit confusing because I just said it wasn't dead zones, but what an anti-dead zone slider does, because sliders like this, they've been around in Steam and other software before. They can't actually change the firmware dead zone of a controller. They can't actually change the software dead zone that's baked into a game, right? If your game has dead zone and sensitivity settings, check those first. If it doesn't and it has that kind of dead zone baked in, what the anti-dead zone slider does is overcome that by kind of shifting that sensitivity curve. So whether it's the game or just your preferences, you want a really sensitive joystick, what you can do is take the slider and drag it up a little bit. And you may kind of have to play with the level to find out the level that you actually want. And you can actually do this in the game profile. So you can adjust it on a per game basis. So games that have a strong dead zone or a built-in sensitivity curve that you don't like, adjust it for that game in the game profile and it'll feel better. And if there are games that feel fine with it at 0, leave that at 0, or you can adjust it here globally. So that gives you a little bit more control over the sensitivity of the joystick and the games that you're playing. What the ideal solution to this would be something even more fine-grained where you have control over the full curve, kind of like what we offer on the Raikiri. And our team is looking into that. We're investigating whether that's an option for the Ally. We'd like to do something like that for the power users that really want to dial it in. But this will take you a lot of the way there if you still find that certain games you're not getting that sensitivity that you want. So that I know has been a long time coming. Really excited to see that here. It's there now. We also in this update had a few bug fixes for like the XG Mobile, external keyboards, and more stuff like that. And of course, this is all in addition to the other features that we added since launch, like hold to repeat functionality. We've added more options to the command center as we've gone on. UI improvements. We now have the battery level in command center, which is something that Jake and I have been asking for since we first got our Ally.
Yeah.
We've added that.
Way before
more
day
VRAM
one.
options. Yeah, before anyone even had theirs. More VRAM options, so you can choose your VRAM allocation, not just 4 gigs or 8 gigs, but you can go 5, 6, 7 gigs if you want. Wider compatibility with USB-C docks, new GPU drivers. We have added so much stuff to the Ally since its release. They also had an update. I don't know if you saw this, Jake. We had an update that allowed the display to go even dimmer than it originally could.
Oh, nice.
For when you're like, because like sometimes I'll play in bed like at night in the
Right.
dark, and it was like even at 10 nits or whatever, it felt steering when I was at pitch blackness. So they actually allowed it to go even dimmer.
Airplanes was when I really felt like conscious of the brightness. So that's really good. Yeah.
Especially if you're on a cross country trip or whatever and they turn all the lights off and stuff. Yeah, exactly. I feel like I'm blinding all of my plane mates. So yes, guys, the Ally has not been ignored or abandoned in any way. We've released like 10 software updates since it launched, so many new features, and there is still more coming down the pipe. I see some questions in the chats. So I want to address this before I move on. I don't have any new info related to the SD card reader. Our answer to that is the same as it's been. If you run into any issues of any kind, RMA your device. We will repair it for you. You can get more info on that in our Discord. We actually have a special email set up for that. You can type !Discord in chat to get to link to the Discord. I know I also have seen a question or two on like, oh, when are you going to implement this feature? Like, what's the ETA on X or Y? We generally can't answer those questions. There is more coming down the pipe, but schedules are changing all the time. And we don't want to like overpromise anything until like a feature is finalized. Like we'll tell you about it when it's out. That's just how our team works. We kind of want to do it right. We don't want to make people mad by saying that something is coming and then it gets delayed or it gets canceled or it doesn't work out the way we wanted. Like, that's just kind of a recipe for disaster. What you can do, however, if you want notifications every time there is an update on Ally related things, again, join our Discord, join the channel called ROG Ally Updates. And in that, there's a thread called the ROG Ally Tracker. You can follow that thread. And Jake, correct me if I'm wrong. When you follow it, do you get notifications when a new update is posted, or is it just like, or it'll let you know in the sidebar that there's like a new message in that thread?
We would have to in the message we'd have to do @here, but then they would get the notification. But as long as we do that in each post.
So maybe what I'll do is in the Discord, because I know people want to like be really, really up on this stuff, right? So what I might do is when you go to our Discord, when you sign up for your roles at the beginning, sign up for that news and announcements role. And for major Ally updates, I'll ping that role within the ROG Ally Tracker. So you get a notification in your Discord when there are new updates for you, whether it's a software update or new information that we've released or something like that. So That's what we'll do. Go join the Discord. In addition, if you have questions, if you want tips, technical support, whatever, our community in that Discord is really great at helping with those kinds of things too. So that's a great place to be. And our team is always monitoring the Discord and Reddit for feedback and taking it into account as they continue to develop and support the Ally going forward. So do
This
not
is still just the
hesitate
beginning,
to,
right? And
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I'm super, super excited for the future of the Ally. I can't believe how much better it's gotten, I was so stoked when I got this. I loved it, and I could not have imagined some of the stuff that has already come out.
Agreed.
Sorry, taking a sip of my tea there. So
how dare you?
Yeah, I know. So with all of that in mind, I want to talk today about a few other ways to optimize games on the Ally. And actually, this applies to laptops and PCs as well, but I think it applies the most to the Ally, and it's kind of the most interesting on the Ally because it's a handheld where you're working with a slightly more limited power envelope. And tweaking some of those in-game settings can really, really make a difference. And you really have to balance. You could go for max performance, turn everything on low, or you could go for max graphical fidelity. But striking a balance between the two, I find, is usually the best way to go. But that can sometimes take some knowledge and practice. So we're here to do it, to show you how, using the Ally as an example. Because presets like low, medium, high, ultra, those are just the beginning. Like you could just slap it on one of those and call it a day. But the thing is, the different settings are going to fall in different places along that like line of performance to visual fidelity. So I whipped up this like silly little graph that I want to show you guys to like kind of explain this. Okay. Let's assume we're going to use Forza Horizon 5 today as our example, but this really applies to any game. Let's assume these dots on this graph are different graphical settings. Shadow quality, texture quality, things like that. Each setting has a certain amount of performance impact, that's the y-axis here, and a certain amount of visual impact. That's more subjective, but still, that's the x-axis here. So, I just realized I can't actually point to these dots specifically with my mouse. But let's there are some settings that are going to maybe have a big impact on performance and a big impact on visuals. So that would be like all the way in the upper right-hand corner of this graph. Those are the ones that you really have to decide whether they're worth it, because you turn it down and you'll notice the difference in visuals, but also you gain some performance from it. That's a tough decision to make, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But then there are some, and this is where the real optimization comes in, where something has, let's say, a really high visual impact, like it changes the looks heavily, but it doesn't affect performance very much. And in that case, yeah, crank it to ultra and leave it because it's not going to affect your performance. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have things that affect performance really heavily, like you turn it to ultra and you lose a ton of frame rate, but you can't really notice the difference visually. And in that case, turn it down to low. Who cares? You can barely even notice the difference. And that's something where the Ally is really interesting too, is because it has a more compact screen. Some of that stuff you can get away with a little bit better because you're not, if you're playing on a 32-inch 4K display, you see every single pixel right in front of your eyes. On the Ally, not quite so much. So let's dive into Forza Horizon and look at some examples of this, because this can make a really big difference in how your game looks and feels. I realize now that I should have launched Forza a second ago, because now we're going to have to...
I know. I thought you'd be prepared.
I know. You know what? I said to myself to do that, but then I got talking, and I always get distracted when I start talking. So you know how it goes.
I do.
But this is one of the... And by the way, so we have optimized settings for a lot of these games. So for example, Forza, you're not going to have to do this manually with Forza. I'm popping a link in chat right now. These are the settings I recommend on Forza Horizon 5 for the Ally. Boom. There you go. We have optimized settings for a number of other games too, and there are other YouTube channels that do this kind of stuff. Digital Foundry does optimized settings, although they're usually more for like PCs rather than handhelds. So sometimes you may need to like scale back their settings a little bit depending on what you're playing. But they're starting points, right? And if there's a game that we haven't covered in our guides, I'm going to use the Ally in docked mode with my Raikiri here. If there's a game that we haven't covered, you can figure these out for yourself this way. So here's Forza. We're just going to dive in, and I'm going to hope it's not nighttime because that kind of ruins this. Nighttime, it's hard to see shadows and things like that.
Is it just a coin flip?
It has like a day and night cycle, and yeah, it
Okay.
doesn't seem to be based on anything. What we can do though is if it's night, we can actually, you know what? I'm probably going to jump into a race anyway, because that is the best way to kind of keep it consistent. And there are a few spots in this race that I think I know we can look at. Yeah, see, it's evening time, which looks beautiful in this game, but not always as great for trying to show off what I'm trying to show off. So let's take a little drive. Here we go. I'm also using this car for a very specific reason that I will show you guys in a little bit. Excuse me, I'm not very good at driving it on sand. Also, there's like a delay between the Ally and my like OBS because I'm viewing this on another machine. So yeah, guys, I'm not usually this bad at this game. I swear. I'm playing it with a massive amount of delay right now. So we're going to dive into this race, and then we're going to look at the settings and kind of play with some stuff. And I'm going to use... This is not generally a car that you would use this race for, unless you really just want to compete with a lot of other Ford Broncos, but this is what I'm doing.
Is that a thing? Bronco only races?
I mean, so when you pick a car for a race, it will pit you against other cars of similar types.
I see.
So that way, if I wanted to race my Bronco in a road race for some reason, it's not pitting my Bronco against a bunch of like, you know, Ferraris or whatever. Like it would not be a very fair race. So it pits me against other similar cars, which means you end up with a lot of like, you'll have a couple people driving the same car as you. All right, here we go. So I'm going to drive right up here because we're going to look at shadows first, I think. And I'm just going to lose this race. That's okay. Let me just inch forward here. All right, we're going to talk about a couple different settings. So let's dive into the settings here. First of all, I'm going to talk about this with regards to the Ally, but you can kind of adapt this for any machine that you're playing on. Oh, well, this is, for some reason, the frame rate is at 30 frames per second right now. I'm not sure what happened there. That's going to be OBS doing that. I had it
because you're capturing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I had it capturing at 60 earlier. I must have accidentally hit a setting. So for resolution, I always recommend choosing the native resolution of the Ally, which is 1080p. And then if you want to get more performance, you can scale it with FSR or something like that, which we'll talk about in a minute. If the game doesn't have FSR, keep it at 1080p and then turn on RSR in the command center. Sometimes I think you need to put the game at 720p, but then turn on RSR so it's scaling it to 1080p. If you don't turn on RSR and you just put the game at 720p, then it's just use the display's scaling rather than AMD's slightly more intelligent scaling. So 1080p with FSR or 720p with RSR. I also don't recommend putting it at 720p and then using FSR, because then you start you're rendering the game at like 540p and scaling it up. It's going to look worse. You're better off leaving the game at 1080p and then changing the FSR preset down from quality to balanced or performance rather than turning the resolution down and putting FSR at quality. Like that, then you're kind of double scaling. It doesn't make as much sense. Frame rate, well, you would usually put this to 120 FPS so that you get the max out of the Ally, but OBS is being a little bit weird for me now. And then motion blur. I'm going to mention this. This is personal preference. I actually think it looks good in Forza. Racing games are one of those few games where motion blur is actually, it gives you this really cool sense of speed. First-person shooters, I would personally turn that off, but it's personal preference. You do you.
Just out of curiosity, in any instance, would motion blur impact performance?
A little bit, not necessarily tons. So you'll see if we actually go into the graphics settings here. So it'll affect performance a little, but it's not as big as a lot of the other settings that we're going to look at. So motion blur quality here, like we could turn that higher and it may affect performance a little bit to turn it off or to different levels of quality. But it's not going to be a huge impact in most cases. But this stuff can vary from game to game. So when we were talking about that graph earlier, you know, how shadows might have a big performance impact and a big visual impact. In some games, that may not be true. That tends to be true for like shadows. But I think, so for example, Spider-Man, I don't think it has as big of an impact in Spider-Man as it does in, say, Forza or like Red Dead Redemption 2. So this graph will change based on what game you're playing as well, which is why you can't just do the same thing every time. Though there are some general guidelines that you can follow. So the last thing I want to mention on this screen is anti-aliasing. So in Forza, I mean, in a lot of games, it's kind of mixed up FSR with the anti-aliasing settings. Because we can get pretty good performance in Forza on the Ally without FSR, I like to turn on TAA for anti-aliasing. When you look at like power lines, let's see if I can actually, let's see if they're anywhere where, oh yeah, perfect. So there's some power lines right here. You can see these actually look really good, really nice and straight at 1080p with TAA on. Now, I can get more performance if I turn TAA off. And that will give me some extra frames, but it's going to make those edges a little bit more jagged. So I don't know if you can see this because it's a little bit compressed on the stream, but when I'm looking at it on the Ally, there is a noticeable difference. And I hate jagged edges. I hate them so much. So I turn on anti-aliasing whenever possible. For you, you may not notice it as much. So these optimized settings are going to be different from person to person. Your other option is turning on FSR if your game has it. That has the benefit of increasing performance and kind of adding some anti-aliasing. So now those power lines look kind of straight again because FSR has a level of anti-aliasing built into that scaling algorithm. It's going to smooth things out more than 1080p native. So that's, I mean, and that's why you hear AMD and NVIDIA talk about how sometimes FSR and DLSS can look better than native in certain scenarios because it has that extra layer of FSR or of anti-aliasing, where if you're playing native without anti-aliasing, you're going to get a lot more jagged edges. That said, I still think TAA looks best in this game, so that's what I use. Oh yes, save. Okay, now let's talk about some of the graphics settings. Anisotropic filtering is a great example of a setting that has a pretty decent visual impact and very little performance impact. You can almost always crank this up to high or ultra. Sometimes it's a numerical value like 8x or 16x. Turn it up almost always. What it does is it when you're looking, so I'm going to go into the game. When you're looking at like the road in front of you and some of the stuff kind of in the distance here, that stuff is going to be clearer with anisotropic filtering higher. If you put it lower, that stuff is going to be a little bit more blurry. But again, it especially with stuff at an angle like on the road, but it almost never affects performance. So that's an example of one you can turn up. I'm not going to go through every setting. I'm just going to go through a few of the ones that are really good kind of rules to follow. Shadow quality is often one of the biggest visual and performance differences in a game. So it makes it one of the hardest settings for me personally to find the sweet spot in a situation like this. So let's look at what extreme shadows look like in Forza. I'm going to back up a little bit. So you can see there's a lot of details in the shadows here. They're really stable. They're really smooth. And you can see each of those like individual palm fronds in the shadow on extreme. But our performance is going to be significantly lower than when we had shadows turned down. And on something like the Ally, you really got to make choices and decide where you're going to claw back some of that performance. Now in Forza, if we turn the shadows to low, the shadows still look okay. So there's not nearly as much detail in like the individual palm fronds in the shadow. And you can see that in the wind, they're moving at a lower frame rate. That's not too bad. If you turn it up to medium, that frame rate may improve. But in a game like Forza, you're driving really fast most of the time. And so you're probably not going to notice the shadows going at low frame rate because by the time the shadows have updated, you're long gone, hopefully, if you're good. So you can fiddle with that. See, we're getting a little bit more detail there. But this isn't bad, and I'm very okay with low shadows in this game, especially on the Ally's more compact screen. However, in other games, it's a much more difficult decision. You may find that in some games, the shadows on low have this like wobbly effect. They go like, or they get really blocky, or they get they start to flicker. That's the one that really drives me crazy. If you have shadows on low that start like flickering like crazy and like wobbling, I can't handle that. So I'm willing to give up some performance and turn it up to medium or high in those scenarios. So it depends on the game you're playing. You kind of have to test the settings and see which one bothers you the most or whether you're worth getting some more performance back. Now, for giggles, I'm also going to turn shadow quality off because when you look at this, all of a sudden,
It
this
feels
game
real
looks
flat.
really. It
Yeah.
feels real flat. And so this is a similar. I'm gonna also a lot of the same rules here apply to SSAO. So SSAO is ambient occlusion. That's what the AO stands for. Much like shadows, you I don't ever recommend turning shadows or ambient occlusion off. There are very few games where off is maybe okay, but when you turn it all off, it looks like this. Like it looks crazy
PS2.
flat.
Good to
It
see
looks
you.
like it looks like 10 years older. So if you desperately need the performance, like if you're running on like a 15-year-old laptop and you can barely run this thing at like 15 frames per second with all the graphics turned off, sure, go for it. But in general, you got to at least have shadows and SSAO on. I think so. You and I actually talked. Diablo 4 was one of those few games where you could actually turn SSAO off and it didn't make a huge difference. I think
Right.
that has to do with the top-down view. You're not as, but SSAO basically adds little shadows to areas where two objects meet. So if you have like a trash can on the ground or like two corners of a building, it'll just add like a little tiny shadow in the corners to give that like more depth.
The pop, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so when you turn off shadows and or ambient occlusion, you give the world a much more kind of like flat, lifeless look.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I recommend for both of those. It is well worth the performance hit that you're going to take by turning those up, or at least on. However, there are other situations where you don't need to worry about that as much. So textures is a great example of something you can usually crank up on the Ally. Textures affect GPU performance a little bit, but and I can't show it because it's going to make me restart the game, but they're usually more VRAM dependent. So if we go over here, textures would affect the quality of like this thatched roof on this building, or the trees up here. Like you can see see all these individual palm fronds on the trees. And if you turn the textures all the way down, you're not going to get that detail. It's going to look kind of blurry and just like this like really low res mess. That if you're working with really limited VRAM, that's okay. But higher textures are going to make a very noticeable impact on the game's overall visuals. And when you have VRAM to spare, you can turn those up. And on the Ally, especially because you can change that VRAM allocation from the default 4 gigs to something like 6 gigs, which I'm using here. At 6 gigs, I can go high textures and I'm fine. And I find that's true of most games. There are exceptions. For example, in Call of Duty Warzone 2.0, I found that with the default 4 gigs, I had to use the lowest texture setting, like very low. And it was really low res. It didn't look great. If I pump it up just a little bit to 6 or 8 gigs, you can crank those textures to low or medium, and it looks so much better. The difference between very low and low is a huge difference, and it only impacts VRAM. You just needed to bump the VRAM up a little bit to make that possible. So that's a setting you can play with in Armory Crate, and then come into your games and crank the textures up a little bit. Finally, one of the other ones I wanted to talk about was reflection quality. This is an example of something that you definitely will notice the differences, and it will affect performance heavily. However, it depends on how often you see reflections in the game. So right now I have reflection quality set to very low, and this is why I chose this car, because it has a straight trunk. You can see what those reflections look like. They're super blocky. And there actually is a lot of stuff that isn't being shown in the reflection, and it just kind of fades out or isn't shown at all. So like these flags, those flags don't show up in my rear window there.
Right.
However, if I turn the reflections up a little bit, and so Forza is one of those examples where you see reflections all the time in Forza. It's one of the few things that's static on screen. Everything else is zooming past you, but those reflections are always in your car window. So if I turn these up to medium, all of a sudden it's still not as sharp as like the outside world, but it's a whole lot less blurry than it was before. And look, there are those flags. And other buildings and stuff start to show up in reflections that weren't there before. So that's something that, again, on the Ally's more compact screen, it doesn't look that blocky. Like it actually looks quite nice. Now, if I was playing on my computer with a 3080 or a 4090, I would crank the reflections all the way up because they look really good when they're cranked all the way up. And it's something that I notice all the time. On the Ally, I had to make a concession. Very low didn't look good enough to me. Very high was too much performance. So I settled on medium. That's what I put in our optimized settings on that. So all of these things you do kind of have to play with a little bit to find your ideal settings. It's going to be different from game to game. It's going to be a little bit different from person to person. I'm going to drop a link in chat. We have done optimized settings guides for, did you just take it away? For a number of games on the Ally. Pretty much the most popular games that are around right now that we're seeing on different platforms. That's kind of where I wanted to start as new games come out. Like I went after Diablo 4 came out, I wrote a new article for that one. So click that link. You can see all of our optimized game guides. If we don't have it, or if you want to check whether a new game is available, just search optimized settings for your game. If we don't have it, someone else on YouTube or Reddit or something may have come up with their own settings. Treat those like a starting point, because again, what you might not care about those reflections, right? You might be like, Whitson, that's stupid. Why would you turn those up to medium and give away FPS for a stupid tree in the back of your window? More frames win games. And I would say, okay, fine. Then turn them down. Like, all of this is a starting point, but it's a better starting point than just turning it on medium or high and calling it a day. And it allows you to just fine tune the few things that you might differ from me on. So, or you might differ from the other person who wrote those optimized settings. So look it up, play around with it, and have fun. This is the best part about PC gaming, is being able to tinker to your taste.